So thank you to the organizers for inviting me to present at the conference. My name is Dr. Melissa Arcand, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Soil Science at the College of Agriculture and Bioresources at the University of Saskatchewan. And I'm actually recording this presentation from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan. And so I'm happy to be here and to be able to talk about some of the work that I've been doing. I've been working on, as I mentioned, I'm a soil scientist. And so my research work is really focused on examining how agricultural management practices and land use can impact the soil. And in turn, what might that mean for agricultural production and agricultural productivity? And more recently, my research has focused on working with First Nations communities around questions of agricultural land tenure and land use on soil sustainability and soil health. And so the focus of my talk is really going to be about the importance of soil as it's central to First Nations agricultural management. And I understand that many of the other speakers at this conference are going to be, expressing really interesting and innovative ideas around how agriculture can be, better engaged in Indigenous communities. And so I'm going to take sort of a land-based sort of perspective on what the opportunities might be, but also what some of the constraints and potential challenges that we need to consider when moving forward in innovating and advancing Indigenous agriculture. So very excited to be here and to talk about some of my work. So the soils in the prairies, they have provided the foundation to the agriculture sector since the first plow broke the native prairie. And that's because our soils are inherently rich in fertility and organic matter. And so what is organic matter? Organic matter is that material that's contained in the soil that gives a soil that dark color. So the darker your soil, the blacker the soil, the sort of higher organic matter there is in that soil. And why is organic matter important? Well, organic matter contains a lot of nutrients that crops need, that plants need. And organic matter can also bind the soil together. It can help the soil form really good soil structure, which enables water to be stored. It enables water to move freely through the soil, and it enables plants to be able to access that water. So why on the prairies do we have a lot of organic matter? Well, that organic matter comes from the native grasslands that were here for millennia prior to settlement, that over the thousands of years, through bison grazing, through fire, through management, actually, by Indigenous people, these grasslands were able to input large amounts of organic matter because the root systems of those grasses, those native grasses, root systems were incredibly extensive. And when those roots, parts of those roots would die, decompose, regrow, die, decompose in this continual cycle, it would constantly be adding organic matter to the soil and building it up over time. And so in the prairies, we've had this massive, basically, savings account of carbon, of nutrients that has supported the prairie agricultural sector for the last 150 years or so. It's an incredibly important resource. But it's really important to remember that our soils are not uniformly suitable for agriculture, nor immune to degradation. And this was learned the hard way, especially during the Dust Bowl era in the 1930s, when vast amount of our soil was being eroded during the drought and due to high winds. We lost a lot of our fertile topsoil. Luckily, since then, agricultural practices have improved over the decades to protect our soil resources. And most recently, with the large-scale shift and adaptation of no-till agriculture and direct seeding. And so this has protected our soils from erosion. It's improved soil organic matter. But there are further challenges to be overcome, and no single practice will be a solution, especially in the face of climate change. And we've seen, the devastating impacts of climate change on the agricultural sector this year. This has been an incredible drought. Crop productivity has completely tanked this year. And so the agriculture sector is going to continue facing these challenges. And so for agriculture to remain viable and to be resilient in the face of these challenges, we must take careful stewardship of our soils. So why is soil important? What does it do? I've already kind of mentioned some of these things. Well, of course, soils are central to crop production. They provide the anchorage for crop roots. They store and supply water for crop uptake. They provide nutrients that can be supplemented by fertilizer if needed. And soils are really the foundation for agricultural productivity. But soil mismanagement can lead to degradation. And so this can really reduce profitability. It can increase risk of environmental pollution. So if soils are degraded, they're more susceptible to things like erosion, for example, a runoff of nutrients that can affect and pollute surface waters, as well as potential losses of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really critical that we sustainably manage our soil resources to support our agricultural activities. Now, in addition to soils supporting agriculture, soils and agricultural soils are also really key players in mitigating against climate change. And that's because soils are able to store a lot of carbon in their organic matter. So that black material, as I mentioned before, that organic matter, that's made almost 50% of carbon. And so it can store a lot of carbon. And our ability to store more carbon in the soil means that less of it is in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. So soil management in an agricultural context can serve dual purposes that sort of feed back from each other. One is just providing, the fertility and the structure for crop productivity to sort of exist in. But also some of those other aspects that can help mitigate against climate change. And together, those practices that promote mitigation also promote resilience to the agricultural production system as a whole. Now, relating this to Indigenous agriculture, there's a lot of excitement around engagement of Indigenous people and First Nations communities in agriculture. And a lot of this excitement centers around the fact that many First Nations communities have expanded and continue to expand their agricultural land bases, through treaty land entitlement or through monies garnered through specific claims, etc. Now, at the federal and provincial level, governments are also interested in supporting Indigenous agricultural initiatives and even the private sector. So at the federal level, Agriculture Agri-Food Canada is now offering programs that can support Indigenous agricultural activities. And at the provincial level, Saskatchewan's growth plan includes growing Indigenous participation in the province's natural resource industries. And specifically within the agricultural sector, the government has stated their plan to work with Indigenous communities to encourage and support agricultural production on Indigenous-owned lands. But there are a lot of barriers and gaps in knowledge to fully realizing the potential for Indigenous communities to engage in agriculture on their lands. And so my research and a lot of the research that my colleagues are doing within the College of Agriculture and Bioresources is focusing in on how can we get there? How can First Nations communities maximize the benefits of farming on their own land? First, by taking stock of the lands that First Nations hold, which includes their soils and their capacity to support agriculture. But before we can talk about moving to the future, I want to just step back a bit in time and talk about how history has shaped the soils that we have on First Nations and how that poses both challenges and opportunities as we move forward in advancing and innovating Indigenous agriculture. So I'm sure many of the attendees of this conference are very familiar with the fact that Indigenous people have always been innovative in agriculture. They were some of the first to experiment with summer fallow, which of course conserved soil moisture, in our very moisture-limited environment. And they often outcompeted European settlers in crop production. In fact, Indigenous people on their prairies were quite successful in those early years, and the success has been very well documented. There's newspaper articles that highlight this. Even Indian agent records of crop yields, etc., have indicated their success. And in large part, a lot of the success of those early farmers that adopted Western style agriculture, some of the reason why they were more successful is that they had a much better understanding of the environment in which they were practicing agriculture. They understood the environmental constraints, and they learned how to work within those boundaries and with nature to ensure that crop productivity could be successful within those bounds. And so that's a really key point that I want to make, is that, even in the past and in present day, agriculture is always going to be bound by those environmental constraints, and our innovations are going to help us adapt to those constraints. And this is going to be a constant sort of step in innovation in Indigenous agriculture, and it's always been there. But what's key to remember is that, yes, indeed, we are kind of working within these environmental constraints, and that includes the constraints of the soils. So I'm sure all of you are also very familiar with the multitude of barriers that undermined Indigenous peoples' efforts to farm the land and to be an equal partner and player in the agri-food sector on the prairies. Many of you would have heard, about the pass system, the permit system, the peasant farming policies, the farm colonies, and of course the Indian Act itself that undermined Indigenous participation in agriculture. And as a result, there was, massive declines in the number of Indigenous farmers throughout the prairies, and that leads up, even more recently with the dismantling of the Indian, SIAP, the Saskatchewan Indian Agricultural Program in the 1990s. So there's always been sort of these structural, political, economic barriers, that prevented Indigenous people from participating in agriculture to the full degree that they're, the white settlers, their neighbors, who were able to. And so that, that's an important history that not many people outside of the Indigenous community are aware of, but it still has its impact and imprint on Indigenous people's perception of agriculture, participation in agriculture. And so, with conferences like these, it's really breaking down some of those barriers and finding innovative means to move Indigenous agriculture forward in ways that are, self-determined. And so, I think that's really exciting. So, there was, a lot of these policies that really prevented movement of Indigenous people, even physically, if you think about the pass system, but movement forward in terms of developing agricultural capability. But at the same time, the government also, undermined the land itself. The land base itself was undermined. So, of course, as part of the treaties, the reserve lands were meant for agriculture. But ultimately, what of course we all understand ended up happening is that the reserves really served as confinement for First Nations activities, rather than being able to use those lands for agriculture and use our traditional territories for other activities and moving freely. That, of course, for a time in history that didn't happen. And second, we know that for many First Nations, the sizes of the reserve land bases were smaller than they should have been. A fact that, of course, the treaty land entitlement dealt with for many First Nations within the province of Saskatchewan. No, and of course, in addition to this, many First Nations in this province also surrendered lands for sale. And many of these land surrenders were, proven to be, conducted under, nefarious conditions. Many of these have gone through specific claims. Some are still going through the specific claim process. But ultimately, what these land surrenders resulted in was almost 300,000 acres of land that was surrendered by First Nations to the Crown in Saskatchewan alone. And this was expanded not only in Saskatchewan, but also, across the country. Manitoba and Alberta also lost a lot of land. Okay, so why does this matter? Why am I talking about this history? I'm talking about it because it relates a lot to the kinds of soils that we have to deal with today. So when I talk about environmental constraints and I talk about soil constraints, this history kind of sets the literal boundaries of what, at least from a soil perspective, what those constraints might be. So in this slide here, I've got a few maps that I'm showing, and I'm going to kind of use this one example here to kind of illustrate how land surrenders, had a big impact on the kinds of soils that we had. I mean, everybody, at least most Indigenous people who are involved in the agricultural sector or understand that a lot of the land that was surrendered was our highest quality land. But I'm going to illustrate this more specifically with this example here. I forgot to mention at the beginning of the presentation that I'm actually from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, and my parents farmed there up until 2016 when they retired. And a lot of the land that they farmed, well, 100% of the land that they farmed was reserve land. And so some of this information that I'm talking about now just comes from my own personal understanding of what happened there. But I'm going to use this to illustrate, again, how does this relate back to the soil? So on the left-hand side, we have the reserve boundaries of Muskeg Lake, which is in the south, and then our neighbors, Mistawasses, to the north. And on the right-hand side, I have 2 soil maps. So Muskeg Lake soil map and Mistawasses' soil map. And these soil maps were constructed by the Saskatchewan Institute of Pedology. And so the Institute of Pedology actually used to be based in my department, so the Department of Soil Science at the University of Saskatchewan. And then in the 1960s, the Institute of Pedology underwent a very large survey of reserve lands within the agricultural region of Saskatchewan. So over 50 First Nations reserve lands were surveyed. So soil scientists went out to the First Nation and they literally mapped all of the soils within the reserve boundaries. And so we can see within these maps the different soils that can be found within the 2 First Nations communities. So we've got quite a diverse differences of soils. But what they also did when they mapped out these soils is they also mapped out the agricultural capability classes of these soils. And so I'm going to show what those capability classes look like for both communities. So in this slide here, again, we've got our soil map. In this case, the information that was contained in those maps that were first created in the 1960s, they've been digitized, and I've taken that digital information and I've put it in this colorful map. And so the boundaries that we see there, those white boundaries, are Muskeg Lake again and Mistawasses. And in the 1930s, up until the early 2000s, the rural municipalities, their soils were also surveyed. So we have the information about the soil capability, agricultural capability of the RMs, as well as within the First Nations boundaries. And so the way that this color coding system works is that the dark green, so the dark green indicates class 1 land, and then the lighter green, class 2, lighter green, class 3, and so on and so forth. So the class 1 land would be the highest agricultural capability. So those are the lands that have sort of the least constraints to annual crop production. And as you go up in number, the land becomes more marginal for annual crop production. There's far more constraints to be able to produce a good annual crop. And so class 1 and class 2 lands, they would be, very good annual crop production lands. Class 3 lands, you can still crop annual crops like canola, wheat, but they're becoming a little bit more marginal. Class 4 and class 5 lands, those would be your pasture lands. And class 6, 7, and O, those would be lands that would be left untouched. Those are your, there's probably ravines, probably really steep slopes. There's native vegetation, whether grassland or bush or forest on those lands. And so what we can see here is that at least in the 1960s, Muskeg Lake had a, pretty large, large representation of class 2 land. So a lot of good agricultural land, some class 4, some class 3. And then Mistawassis, had a lot of class 4 land, some class 3 as well. And so these are the boundaries of the reserve lands in the 1960s. Now, both of these reserves in the early 19th century, in 1911, 1919, they surrendered some of their lands as part of the soldier settlement. And in total, Mistawassis surrendered about 19,000 lands and Muskeg about 8,000 lands. And you can guess, without me even showing you, probably where those surrendered lands were. And yes, in fact, if I expand the map to show what those original reserve boundaries are or were, you can see that the both communities lost all of their class 1 land in that surrender. So it was, no mistake or no coincidence that the land that was surrendered was the highest quality land. And of course, anecdotally, and even legally, this has been documented through specific claims processes, which have shown, that many of these lands that were surrendered were the best quality lands. And so you can think about the lost opportunity of not being able to farm those lands for decades. But what this also meant is that the land that was left over, the land that we did have to work with, was more marginal land. So we had a higher proportion of marginal lands that we were meant to be able to use for agricultural purposes and try to compete in the larger agricultural sector. So again, we had these constraints, these environmental constraints, due to the simple fact of our reserves containing a higher proportion of marginal lands. And so this history of marginalization still has its imprint on our soils within First Nations communities today, and again, literally sets the boundaries of the environmental constraints, at least with respect to the soil that we're dealing with. And so we can look at this a little bit more broadly, not just Muskeg and Mistawassis, but of the 74 First Nations communities in Saskatchewan, more than 50 of them are located south of the boreal forest in the agricultural region. And so what I'm showing here is just a Google Earth map of Saskatchewan. And if we look really closely in at this Google Earth image, we can start to see how First Nations reserve lands within the agricultural region of Saskatchewan are unique. They literally stand out. So if you look closely, we can see postage stamps of green scattered southeast to the northwest across the agricultural region. And that's where many of the First Nations community tend to be clustered. So I can move the map forward and you can see the reserve boundaries. And where you see those clusters of green, that really tends to be where many First Nations are actually located. And so, what this is really showing us is that the story of First Nations reserve lands has historically been one of marginalization, and one that we can plainly see borne out to present day. And so this has implications to present day agricultural land management and how we might look forward to agricultural innovations. Sort of has impact in two ways. Well, one, there is a higher proportion of land within First Nations communities that still contains native vegetation. So whether that's bush, whether that's native grassland, these are, basically conservation areas of biodiversity, of potential for carbon storage, mitigating against climate change. So that's on the positive side of things. On the challenge side of things is that, because we have a higher proportion of marginal lands, we have more challenges in terms of ensuring that we're managing those lands sustainably. So looking forward, sort of zooming in out from those, that satellite image to looking at some images actually from the field. I've got some examples of what, land looks like, class 2 land, which would be, very good agriculturally productive lands versus class 3 lands. And so there is indeed some very good farmland on First Nations reserves, but again, a higher proportion of that land is marginal. Maybe it had been cultivated or used as pasture and has since been, potentially abandoned or left fallow. Now, so for example, in these photos here, the top two show fields on class 2 lands. So these are lands that have high capability to support annual grain production. So there are very few constraints. And you can see from these photos that, the land is relatively flat. So that makes it's easy to work the land that way, to move equipment across the land. It also prevents soil erosion from being a dominant process, at least from tillage erosion or from water erosion. There's probably really good soil texture that enables good moisture retention, good supply of nutrients. So these are good high quality lands. Now, the two fields on the bottom, on the other hand, show class 3 lands that have lower capability. There are more constraints. They tend to be on land that has poor soil texture. There's some steeper slopes, and you can actually see in the images on the bottom, so on the right-hand side, you can see a patch of soil erosion. And where you've got that bare soil, we can see that there's weeds that have cropped up. And then on the left-hand side, we've got really sandy soils, and these soils have eroded quite severely. So both of these lands have experienced, quite a bit of degradation and are less likely to be resilient to stress. So for example, if we had a really wet year, really heavy rain year, those soils are going to be much more susceptible to erosion. Or if in contrast, like a year like this year, where we've got really intense drought, those soils don't have the organic matter, they don't have the good soil structure to be able to hold moisture and keep what little rainfall you might have got stored in the soil so that the crops can access that moisture. And so, of course, as these soils become degraded, the profitability of farming this land becomes more and more marginal. And so we need to keep this in mind when making decisions about how to manage the land and what practices might be most sustainable over the long term. We need to think about that long-term sustainability in order to maintain that productivity and profitability over the long term. So, as I mentioned before, agricultural land capability was surveyed and mapped out by the Saskatchewan Institute of Pedology back in the 1960s. And these soil survey maps are available online. Anyone can access them. All this information is at our fingertips. And this information that was surveyed in the 1960s provides really important information that is still relevant today. So if you're interested in purchasing land, taking a look at these maps in advance can be really helpful. If you're thinking about making any land use change, in either, breaking land for crop production or, where's a good spot for a housing development, these maps are incredibly useful. But there's limitations to that information. Research on soils in First Nations has been pretty much absent since the 1960s. And so we don't know whether or not, management of these lands over the long term has caused any changes to the quality of the soils. Agriculture has changed a lot since the 1960s. Since the 1960s, people have moved towards no-till. They've moved towards continuous cropping. They're planting more high-yielding crop varieties. They're growing varieties that weren't on the land in the 1960s, like pulse crops, like peas, lentils, chickpeas, etc. And so a lot has changed since soils were, originally examined on First Nations communities. And in addition to that, as Indigenous farmers, as the number of farmers have declined, more and more First Nations are leasing their lands out to non-Indigenous farmers who don't have the long-term history of farming that land necessarily. So in fact, for many First Nations that I've communicated with, there has been concerns that long-term leasing may have degraded soil quality. But unfortunately, we haven't looked at the soils over time, so we don't know if this has actually happened or not. Have soils degraded? Have they maintained similar quality as in the past? Are they different from their neighboring RMs? But what I would argue is that given that land use and land tenure history on First Nations lands have differed from neighboring RMs, it's not safe to assume that the quality of the soils are the same. And in other areas in Canada, what researchers have found, and this is on non-Indigenous lands, but what researchers have found is that lands that are rented versus lands that are owned are managed differently. Lands that are rented tend to have more short-term profitability in mind versus long-term environmental sustainability, which can have or economic impacts over the long term as well. So we have questions about that. In addition to, concerns about there being potential of soil quality declines, there's also other reasons why having information about soil is really important. This is where we can have a much better understanding about whether or not each field is fetching a fair market value. Rather than having a blanket leasing rate across the whole reserve, you can start to tailor those lease rates based on the quality of the land, on a field to field basis rather than a blanket rate. So there's lots of reasons why having the soil information is relevant to present day and why it should be updated. So right now, as part of a federally funded project, I'm working with the lands departments from Mistawasis Nehewak as well as Cowessess First Nation, and we're assessing the soils on their agricultural land. And so like many First Nations communities in Saskatchewan, they've increased their land base and are looking to develop their agricultural potential. And so you'll hear a lot more from Chief Cadmus Delorme about Cowessess's Bound Run Farm, and the really amazing success in them acquiring vast number of acres, tens of thousands of agricultural acres through treaty land entitlement. And so this offers amazing opportunity. And so the work that I'm doing with them, as well as with Mistawasis, is to help fill in the gap in understanding of the health of those soils. But what I want to argue here is that, this work is just a drop in the bucket. There are more than 50 First Nations in Saskatchewan's agricultural region. And, First Nations have historically been underserved by the public and private agricultural sector in this province, especially with the dismantling of the SIAP program back in the 90s. We just don't have the same history of research that has been conducted around soil or around agricultural productivity, crop diversification and development within First Nations communities as we've had in the province as a whole. And I think it's really time to fill in that gap. We need to start collecting data, collecting research that can help to inform our agricultural innovations, our agricultural activities. And so here's my shameless plug, is that as a researcher at the university, 100% of my research is funded through agencies outside of the university. And so I'd love to talk with potential partners who are interested in, collecting soil information, agricultural land information that can be used to make informed decisions about agricultural land use and in developing agricultural activities for Indigenous communities. So I'd really love to talk about partnerships that could arise out of the work that we're doing with Mistawasis and Cowessess. Again, this project, it's a 3-year project. We were delayed with COVID in terms of being able to do some of our work, but it is ongoing, and we really hope that we could expand this on a more long-term basis and to more communities. So what we're doing with both Mistawasis and Cowessess is we're analyzing a large suite of soil properties and across as much of the land base as we can. Now, it's impossible to, go as a small research team to cover 100,000 acres. But what we can do is we can be very deliberate in designing a sampling strategy that ensures that the soils that we are sampling are representative of the landscape features as well as the land tenure history. And so in both Cowessess and Mistawasis, we've sampled over 30 quarter sections and collecting over 500 samples per community. And we're currently in the process of analyzing all of those soils for a large suite of properties. So we're looking at soil fertility. So we're analyzing for nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus. We're looking at organic matter. We're looking at carbon, and we're also looking at salinity. And so, what these measures do is they enable us to provide a much more holistic picture of the health of the soil. And this can help to enable more long term planning. Also, in the case of Cowessess, where they have a band run farm, where they have a farm manager who has an agronomy background, who works with agronomists to inform their farm operation. They've implemented the best practice of testing their soils to guide fertilizer applications. And so what this does, it helps to ensure that sufficient nutrient is supplied to the crop, so that the yield potential isn't constrained by fertility. But at the same time, this minimizes potential losses to the environment. And so this is a really good practice. And so the work that we're doing is going to supplement and better inform the information that the farm manager uses to make decisions on a day-to-day basis, on a year-to-year basis. What we're able to provide is a more holistic picture that can examine their soils over the long term. And so working together, this can really, again, start to complete that picture of farm sustainability. So in addition to the soil data, we're also developing a database that is integrated with GIS to manage data for every field. And so this can include all of that soil information data, including any soil data that's collected by the farm manager. This can include management history, such as crop rotation, any inputs such as fertilizers or pesticides that may be used, and of course can also contain information such as crop yields. And so this data management is especially important for long-term planning. To have soil data, yield data, input data all integrated within a GIS means that all that information is just at the click of a button at their fingertips to be able to look towards the long-term planning. Now, I want to get back to talking about soil health again. And part of that is because research into soil health has really taken off in the last decade or so, especially as farmers have been grappling with how to better manage their soils to be able to buffer against more unpredictable growing conditions that are rising due to climate change. We've got droughts, we've got floods. We can have drought and flood in the same year in different parts of the province. The climate has just become that much more variable. And what we've been finding through our research is that healthier soils better buffer against that unpredictable weather, that unpredictable growing conditions that are arising every year. And so recently, my colleague, Dr. Kate Congreves, and one of her graduate students, Athena Wu, they developed a framework for a soil health test in Saskatchewan. And this project was funded through the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. And right now they're in the second phase of the research, which is being initiated this year, and which I'm a part of. And through my partnership with Mistawasis and Cowessess, we're able to integrate the soil health scores that Dr. Congreves is developing across the province to also include Mistawasis and Cowessess. But what I'm hoping is that in future, we can expand that even further to include more First Nations communities so that we can assess the health of their soils using this scoring system. Now, one of the really important findings that Dr. Congreves and her student, Athena, found was that for those soils that had a high soil health score, looking back at historical yield data, And looking back at historical precipitation and temperature, what they found is that crop yields were better able to be buffered in drought years for those sites that had higher health scores. So, what this meant is that in those drought years, yields were able to be maintained in those soils that were classified or scored as having high soil health compared to soils or fields that had a low soil health score. And so her research in the next few years is going to dig more deeply into that relationship between the soil health scoring system that they've developed and crop yields. So again, linking that resiliency to soil health. As Indigenous people, and in looking at agricultural activities, historically we've always been innovative. And I think in conversations that we're having now about moving into more agribusiness ventures and agriculture engagement, we have the opportunity to move beyond business as usual and take on more innovative approaches to agriculture that not only maximizes the economic profitability of these ventures, but also environmental sustainability. So, for example, some marginal lands, could be managed differently, especially if they've experienced some form of degradation, and maybe better served to stay in a natural state or be reclaimed to perennial vegetation than continue to be annually cropped. In fact, research has shown that agricultural landscapes that contain natural features within that landscape that might consist of natural vegetation like wetlands, shelter belts, or that integrate cover crops within the annual cropping system, they can be just as profitable as if the land had continued to be only cropped to annual grain. So even though you might have farmed fewer acres within a field, the overall profitability remains the same as if you had cropped the whole thing. And that's because those natural components actually help buffer and provide other benefits, such as buffering water supply, supporting pollinators, or help to supply nutrients that can reduce the need for inputs. And so farmers have much more, more options, more kind of tools in the toolbox to implement to better support their soil health. Many of these management options that lead to better soil health really rely on either maximizing carbon gains or minimizing carbon losses. And the reason I'm talking about carbon here is that what research has found is that soil health is really improved when soils have a high amount of carbon, which is related to organic matter. And so this can increase the overall soil health status of your field. And so practices that increase carbon inputs through the use of compost or organic amendments. Diversification is actually really key. So the use of cover cropping or intercropping can really help to improve soil health, as well as those practices that ensure that soils and carbon isn't lost. So that those protective soil practices like conservation tillage, no-till, reducing compaction. There are a suite of management practices that could be implemented that move beyond business as usual, that can promote the long-term sustainability and soil health of our agricultural lands. And because we do have a higher proportion of marginal lands, these soil conservation and soil health management practices become that much more important. And when we talk about innovation, we talk about technology in the agricultural sector, we should be using precision agricultural practices to ensure that specific parts of the field are managed given the constraints of those individual locations within the field. We need to prevent that soil erosion. We need to make sure that that soil is kept intact so we don't have erosion happening, for example, so we don't have nutrient runoff and loading into surface water bodies. We need to look at all of our agricultural endeavors with the soil and environmental sustainability in mind. So some of the management options that are available to support soil health are also considered natural climate solutions. It's kind of the buzz phrase right now, especially as we're trying to confront climate change at a national level and meet those Paris Agreement targets in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And we have a lot of potential actually in those lands, in those marginal lands that are in a natural state. They can store a lot of carbon. So we could potentially take advantage of those carbon markets. For some lands, it might actually be more profitable to leave them in their native state. And again, we have a higher proportion of those lands on First Nations. So let's keep those marginal lands under natural vegetation. They could possibly be used for grazing. A lot of communities have expressed interest in rematriating bison onto our lands. This is an awesome opportunity to not only reestablish that relationship with the buffalo, but also enables us to store more carbon, enables us to support more biodiversity. So there's lots of opportunity here. We can restore marginal lands that were unsuitable for cultivation to forests or grasslands. We can keep bush, shelter belts, hedgerows. Agricultural landscapes. Yes, the main goal is to produce crops, but those agricultural landscapes also have value. And in terms of the carbon market, they might actually have economic value that we need to look towards. So supporting management practices that enhance soil health on Indigenous lands will ensure long-term productivity and sustainability. And we really need to increase, the agricultural research that's being conducted on our lands, not only by myself, but also other researchers. For example, researchers that are experts in forage production, that are experts in crop breeding, that are experts in agricultural economics. A lot of the research that has already been conducted has focused in on the economic aspect of farming. That work needs to continue through the lens of First Nations and Indigenous economic development and realities. So there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge, but there's lots of opportunity here to work together to fill in some of those gaps. Now, a few years ago, myself as well as a number of individuals across Saskatchewan, we hosted an Indigenous Agriculture conference at Wanuskewin. And as part of the conference, we were able to have some focus groups with Indigenous participants. And one of the really key themes that emerged from our conference was the central role of the environment, of the land and land stewardship. And so, here are some of the quotes that came out of that of those focus groups that participants said. They focused on these concepts of the land is healthy, the people will be healthy. We are part of the land. We are stewards of the land. We're borrowing this land, really, so we need to do the best that we can. The land is everything, our teacher, our mother. And so it's really important that, at the end of the day, Indigenous agriculture continues to expand and that its innovations keep environmental stewardship in the forefront. Because we're learning more and more that environmental sustainability does not have to be at odds with profitability, at least not in the agricultural sector that is constantly being challenged by environmental and climate constraints. We do need to center environmental stewardship, especially as First Nations communities, at least our reserve land bases, they might be expanding, but they are our only land base. We're not going to sell them off. This is the future legacy that we have. And so in terms of legacy as well, management history is imprinted in the soil. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the reason why the prairies have such a rich store of fertility and organic matter is due to that long-term history of buffalo being on the land, being, interacting with our ancestors, that enabled the development of those rich soils. And so moving forward, the decisions that we make now in terms of agricultural management is going to be imprinted in the soil. The soil tells the stories of the land's history. And so we need to think about what our legacy is going to be moving forward and ensuring that those soils are still going to be healthy, still going to be able to grow a healthy crop, whatever it may be, and under, constantly changing climate and environmental conditions. So with that, I'd like to just acknowledge all of the, important people that have contributed to this work. to compiling the soil data, collecting the soil data, my team at the University of Saskatchewan, and then especially to Cowessess and Mistawassis, the lands departments in both communities, the lands managers, Loretta, Lawrence, Kelsey. They have been, really amazing partners working together. They know each quarter section in and out. They identified the lands that they were most interested in learning more about. So we really structured our soil sampling towards those lands that they identified as being important. And we're really looking forward to working more closely in providing that data back to them, but then also sharing what we can to the broader community so that we can continue to learn and develop our understanding of the impacts of land management on First Nations agricultural land so that we can make these innovative decisions in developing our agricultural land bases. So finally, I'd just like to thank all of you for your attention. Please get in touch with me through email. You can see it on the slide here. I'd love to continue the conversation, and hopefully I can answer some questions either through email or through the chat. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.